Welcome to our first AI in Music Summit. I'm Bob Shammy, host of Soundbreaker. I'm also a music and a tech entrepreneur. I'm honored to be your host today. We're going to talk about things AI in music with the help of our incredible lineup of panelists. These are not just experts, they are pioneers and trailblazers. Introducing our panelists, starting with Dr. Maya Ackerman, who's a genius behind Wave AI, transforming how we create music today. Mr. David Fritz, our superstar entertainment attorney and co-founder of Creative Intel, helping us understand things from legal point of view in this business. Jessica Powell from Audio Shake, who is definitely shaking things up. No pun intended. Her company is revolutionizing audio through AI. David Henkin, who is Forbes contributor with incredible insight. David, can't wait to hear your thoughts on all of this. Last but definitely not least, Mr. Brian Zisook, co-founder of AudioMac, helping us understand the impact of AI on audiences and artists directly. Let's keep the summit fun and engaging chat. I will direct topics at some of our panelists, but please feel free to chime in, ask questions at any time. Our goal is to have an engaging conversation between all of you. We will start with different type of uses. There's a lot of talk about AI generation in music, but I know there's a lot more into it. Dr. Maya and Jessica, would you please kick things off and share with us and our audience some of the different ways AI is being used in music?
Sure, I can get started.
Maya, why don't you kick off? You've been doing it before anyone.
All right, that's good. Can you hear me okay? All right, great. So
Absolutely.
there are a couple of really common use cases, so we can start with those. One that has become popular recently is prompt-based. So you type what kind of music you'd like to hear, and the system generates something like that for you. A lot of it tries to give you sort of tiny but complete pieces of music, complete with lyrics, complete with a backing track, and with some kind of voice singing it, with sort of really interesting variety in styles and quality. Before that, there were and still are a lot of systems that do background track generation. Traditionally, you specify something about the style and genre, and then it creates the backing track. And the technology for this existed for decades. We've had incredible systems that do that since about the 1980s. And then there's my work, which is complementary to that, and that's focusing on lyric and vocal melody generation. And our approach at Wave AI is more about supporting the artist rather than giving the music, which is different, which is more about showing the artist where they can go next based on their own unique style and ideas than it is about giving complete pieces of music. So there are sort of these different use cases, helping an artist or giving a creator music. And I think it's really critical that the industry over time get more clarity about how to create interfaces that really support these different use cases and doesn't sort of secretly remove the rug from under artists. I'm going to pause here and let Jessica expand on the landscape.
So I think Maya covered off the generative stuff really well. A point that she and I are often on panels together and that we inevitably end up coming up with, and this is a good moment, I guess, to introduce it, is that AI is just a massively broad field. We might as well just say statistics or software, or we could come up with any kind of catch-all term to talk about. And so generative is one area of that. And even that, as you heard Maya talking, there are things that are really like push button creation. So there are start to finish generative tools that really no human involvement other than that thing saying go. And then there's all kinds of assistive generative tools as well. Outside of generative, there are, again, a huge number of areas, some of which have been used in the music industry for a very long time. Think about everything that happens behind the scenes around playlisting and recommendations, whether you're talking about music or Netflix, right? All of that machine learning. in the area that we're in, we are in an area of deep learning where we are doing something called source separation, or you could think of it very simply as sound separation. So we are taking a recording, and if it's a film, we're splitting it into dialogue, music, and effects. If it's music, it's into the vocals, drums, bass, and so forth, stems. What Maya does, for example, has very, very little to do with what we do. It is all AI, and AI is largely like sophisticated statistics. And so one thing I think is always just useful to have in the back of your head, whether we're looking at this from a legal perspective, in terms of artist impact, any of these things, is just to remember it's very, very broad. We might as well say software, and really then focus on the specificity of use and any kind of concerns or opportunities that introduces.
Interesting. Anybody else want to contribute? Any of the panelists, feel free, please.
Yeah,
I guess
well,
not.
we're using AI differently than others on our panel today, because we're not doing it to help people create music. We're helping them to create the contracts to protect their rights underneath that music. So obviously, there's use cases, all over the place, and ours is just focused on deal making in the music business to start, and then hopefully, go wider and deeper from there. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And maybe just to build on something Jessica said, I mean, AI is broad, right? I mean, it's going to show up in other big time ways in the world, right? I mean, enhancing automation across industries, improving diagnosis and treatment, and everything from medicine to preventive maintenance and manufacturing. As was noted, get ready for more personalized and engaging user experiences. According to Gardner, AI is near what they call the peak of the inflated expectations on the hype curve. It's in the next 2 to 5 years, we're gonna see it just about everywhere.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I'll just tie a bow on this part of the conversation by reiterating a point that Maya and Jessica honed in on, which is this is not new, right? There have been elements of machine learning that have been incorporated into our lives for a very long time. Its integration into this space at this level in such an immersive fashion
Yes.
is what is brand new. Anyone who's ever used any streaming service since the very first streaming service was built should understand that there has been an AI component that has driven the recommendation engine. What we've seen, though, over the past 5 years is a lot of the human editorial and curatorial work has been set to the side in favor of algorithmic and algatorial. And later we can get into what that has meant overall to artists' discovery by keeping users in this bubble where they're only being served music based on what they've already listened to.
Interesting. Yes. Well said, gentlemen. Well said, ladies and gentlemen. Pros and cons. As everything in life, AI can be used for good or bad. I want to hear from everyone, if possible, on the pros and cons AI. Whoever wants to start first, please.
There are no cons. It's going to save humanity. It's only going to create jobs and happiness for everyone.
Very
Sorry.
positive.
No, yeah, that's right. No, I mean, I think again, I think it's about specificity. Like, I think that if we actually just zoom out for a moment and don't call it AI, let's just call it technology.
Yes.
Right? Like, there are things that get repeated quite a bit in Silicon Valley, which are kind of eye-rolling and kind of true, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which are, that with every major technological innovation from the start of time, or at least from the time when we've been able to document it, right? You see some disruptive technology come in, it gets rid of a ton of jobs, it creates a ton of new jobs, right? You bring in the ATM,
Correct.
everyone thinks that banks are going to disappear or that tellers are going to disappear, and it turns out, no, it actually creates more jobs, right? Just different kinds of jobs. And so, of course, all of us sitting out here in the Valley love to roll this stuff out whenever we talk about job displacement and so on and so forth. But I think that's obviously disingenuous. Like, of course, jobs are going to be impacted. I think when we're talking about the music industry, there are certain areas within the music industry that are going to be impacted In addition to, obviously, some of the legal and ethical concerns around how certain kinds of AI systems are built and trained and then productized and made available to the world, completely independent from the people whose data fed those systems. So I think it probably depends on where we want to go with it, but I think there's just across the board, there's obviously a number of potential problems. At the same time, do I think it's an incredible technology that's going to be everywhere and is going to help us? I mean, I love obviously working with music and AI as a creative. I'm particularly inspired by what might happen with AI in terms of problems like in medicine and, you know, and climate and things like that. So I think most of what we're going to be doing with AI is assistive, but of course it's going to have, you know, impacts, some negative as well.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, AI certainly AI is poised to. I'm so sorry. To significantly impact the world, certainly in the music industry, with new capabilities, benefits, and risks. The capabilities, some of which we discussed, include AI-assisted composition and generation, personalized music recommendations and curation, which we've already seen in some spots, enhanced music production and editing tools, AI-powered music analysis and insights, which has the potential to increase creativity and exploration in music creation, improve discovery for listeners, certainly streamlining music production workflows as AI tools can handle some of the tedious tasks. But the risks are real. I mean, copyright and ownership issues with AI-generated music, we see this in the news. Algorithmic bias and discrimination, potential for misuse of AI for malicious purposes, and the potential for, if you will, homogenization of music. If AI relies too heavily on existing music trends and data, it could lead to a lack of originality and creativity. So certainly the potential for positive impact is there, but there's much more to do.
Yeah, there is
Good point,
Mr.
Henkin.
I think I'm on a slight delay here. I apologize.
Please go ahead,
So,
Dr. Maya.
yeah, appreciate very much what was already shared about the pros and cons. What's sort of unfortunate about the way our world works is that almost anything that has any kind of pros has cons. And I just wanted to comment on a couple of
Correct.
spectrums around that. So one is what I call the co-creativity spectrum. So any tool around music falls somewhere along the spectrum. It's either completely autonomous or it is, lightly assistive or anything in between. Heavily assistive, you could consider that the middle. And depending on what's your target audience, you might create something that or the AI creates by itself, or it helps in various degrees. And you could have people who need music for a video, for like a little skit that they made for YouTube, let's say. And for those people, it's a pro to have a system that generates music autonomously. But it's not so much of a pro for musicians who make their living selling their music, right? So there's definitely some pros and cons for musicians based on what's happening here. And I mean, in part, that's what I do in order to give musicians more tools so that they can have some kind of advantage in this new landscape, which is involving more and more machine systems creating music. The other dimension, I'm only going to point out one more that has interesting pros and cons, is something I started thinking about recently, and that's the nature of creativity itself. So we are entering this era of creative machines, and generally speaking, we like to think of creativity as a positive thing. But when machines are being creative in a deceptive way, we're calling it hallucination. And I think where we haven't paused enough is to consider the fact that creativity itself, even when applied to human beings, has both pros and cons. So, for example, there is really interesting research showing that even in humans, being more creative past a certain point is associated with less honesty and even self-deception. And I'm not here to talk negatively about creativity per se. I think creativity is the most magnificent thing that humanity has. It's just that nothing gives without taking, and creativity even has disadvantages for creative humans. And so it's not surprising that bringing creativity to a machine is coming with some inherent negatives, such as hallucinations, where it's sort of associated with deceit.
Yeah. I'm going to piggyback off of what Maya said. First, I'd like to just point out I myself feel like I'm both creative and honest. So in case anyone was curious, I check both of those boxes. You know, every day at Audio Mac, I interface with hundreds of artists, many of whom are at the very beginning of their journey into music. They are between 13 and 22 years old. They have very limited disposable income to invest into their career. And so there is very little viability in terms of investment in, for instance, a graphic designer to create original artwork to accompany their music, or a publicist to draft up a press release or a bio, or to work with a publisher to get you in the same room with other songwriters when you have writer's block. And so all of these areas, there is a no cost or low cost solution with AI's assistance, right? Canva has a fantastic AI product that can help you create artwork for your music.
Yes.
Chat GPT could be used to draft a press release or create a biography for your website. You know, BandLab is out there. You can use their tools if you have writer's block. And so, again, you know, like Maya said, one does not come without the other, because what this means is professional graphic designers, professional publicists, and songwriters are being impacted by virtue of this technology, but it's going to help get more careers off the ground that otherwise wouldn't have had that opportunity.
Absolutely.
I look at also, like, when I was in college, I took a painting class, and my painting professor would put an image by a projector onto his canvas, and he'd lay out the rough color projecting the image onto the canvas, and then would go in detail it afterwards. Well, we could be doing the same using AI, right? Instead of it just being projected, you know, onto a screen. Instead, it's actually creating it. And then what does the human then do with whatever just got created? So sure, they can create sound on the AI that, you know, some of you are building. And then what do they do with it once they have it? They got to put their voice over it. They can alter it up. It doesn't have to be always the finished final mile. It has to be AI. It's just great start, you know, great jump starting all of that art. So that's how I view it. It's a great dumping point, at least at the beginning now, especially with how AI is. So,
Absolutely. Great point. Anybody else want to, or we can move on to the next subject? Okay. Legal implications. David Fritz, as you know, there's a lot of concerns with AI on the legal side. How do we regulate it and make sure things like copyrights are being protected?
So I don't think we should regulate anything yet. I think it's too early to see, and we got to just let it play out a bit. You know, the new wave that we're going through right now in AI is, you know, the licensing of content for training purposes. And as you know, as Maya had said earlier, you know, like, you don't want to be in a position where your AI is hallucinating, because that doesn't do anybody good if it's hallucinating. So, but you know, OpenAI is now licensing Reddit's content for training. And the issue from a copyright standpoint, there's a couple of. One is, does your AI have the right to listen to the music, or whatever the input is? Does it have the right to review copyrighted work to then train itself? And most of the what I've been reading is most of the AI is actually, you know, the software is actually making copies of the training data. The copying of the training data for the purposes of training the AI in and of itself is a copyright infringement. So that's why you're now seeing licenses and in some cases lawsuits, you know, regarding that. So that's one. And then two is, what's the end result of what's created. If the AI is just outputting something with that the human input is just, like asking it to give a result, the question is that copyrightable? What, but this is like a hard question because it's no different than, you're using, as Brian said, you're using Canva to create, an image. Well, is that not copyrightable because you used software to get there? I mean, when photography first started in the middle of the 1800s, people were saying you couldn't copyright photographic images because it was just an exact copy of what was already being seen by the user. But we quickly learned that's not the case, and it's manipulable, and the human has a lot of control. So the same thing goes here. At what point does the computer stop and the human take over? And is the input the creativity, or is taking the result and then manipulating the result the creativity? But you got to have a human at the end of it. It can't just be machine for the purposes of copyright protection in particular, because copyright needs to be created by a human in order to be copyrightable. There was a lawsuit once that a monkey once was given a camera and photographed an image, and the photograph did not hold up in court as being copyrightable because it wasn't created by a human. So likewise, that's the same issue that we have today with AI.
It's so interesting you bring the photography example. I was thinking as you were talking about, just over 100 years ago, when the automobile was replacing the horse and buggy, to your point about timing, they didn't rush out and make speed limits and road provisions. This was exercised for 10 to 15 years before we started sort of normalizing around standards, for the automobile. And so some exercising, it may not take 10 to 15 years for sure, but some exercising of this may benefit the ultimate rules and guidelines that are adopted.
And Dodge was Dodge cars. Dodge was a carriage maker that got into the car business. So right. Some of the same companies that are already in the creativity business are going to be the ones that are. It's not all going to be software companies that are it's the music business is going to have to embrace, because just they got to learn from the second time around. The first time around being the Napster era. Now we're in the second time around where embrace technology. Don't kick it.
I don't know that they learned anything.
Yeah.
Well, we shall see, right?
Yes.
I really appreciate that this point about waiting to see where things land. I found that very early when generative AI became popular, the copyright office came out and said that basically the contribution of the AI needs to be negligible. But I understand the intent. But the problem is that when you're collaborating with anybody, human or machine, it's impossible. If you're really, really collaborating in a sort of meaningful way, it's often impossible to tell how much who contributed. They found in humans that, if me and Jessica are collaborating, we are each going to think, and we each say how much percent we did, it's more than likely going to add up to over 100%. People regularly overestimate how much they contribute to anything, and that's just human nature. It's nothing sort of, it's nothing wrong with the people who are doing the overestimation. And so as a result, this notion that exactly how much you contributed, and you can with certainty say the machine contributed negligibly when you're using a meaningful generative AI system is just not something realistic.
Yes, true.
I think another thing that that I kind of appreciate some arguments for a measured debate or taking a little bit of time and not realizing we can't. At the same time, I totally understand why that there's a feeling of urgency. But I think that one of the things that often gets lost in the current debate around training data is that it's, first of all, at the end of the day, I think these are largely business negotiations. I don't think this is actually that different from what happened with YouTube, right? And on some level, whatever happens in the courts, I think is only probably down like longer term is super relevant. But in terms of some of these essentially business disputes is actually not, it's relevant, of course. But at the end of the day, I'm pretty sure that all of these large tech companies are going to end up paying to license in the same way that even though in the courts you have fair use and DMCA and all these kinds and safe harbor, all these things, you still don't see any large streaming platform, UGC platform, not licensing music, regardless of the kinds of protections that the law affords them, right? It's just a whole lot simpler to do business by having those licenses in place in terms of the service you want to deliver to your users. And so I think we'll see the same kind of thing. Like the New York Times will get what it wants ultimately in some version or another. I think what gets lost in a bit of all this is one, and I'm glad I'm a lawyer because I don't know how you start to think about this. I don't know what it is that how we distinguish between who deserves protection and who doesn't. Why is it that I used to be an opinion writer for the New York Times? So the New York Times then will eventually have some kind of deal with large tech companies. Why is it that the work that I did for the New York Times is protected, but say a post that I did on my Substack or on Medium is not? If ostensibly the quality is the same and the person is the same, why is it that it's only the powerful essentially that get protected? One. Two, as the writer of those pieces, guess what? I make nothing in either of those scenarios, right? Like whether the New York Times has a license or not, like it's New York Times that benefits from that. And so I think there's just so many, and that's just like one detail, right? In this larger debate, I think there's so many different bits and pieces that have to like fit together that it's going to take a while for us to figure it all out.
Yeah, and that example is pertinent as it relates to the difference between an artist who's signed to one of the three largest record labels in the world, Universal, Sony, or Warner, versus an independent artist who is self-uploading to a UGC platform or using a broad spectrum distributor. The artists who are on the rosters of the major labels are likely going to be the first to reap the benefits of alterations to existing licensing agreements with streaming services, opening up new channels for monetization on top of streaming royalties for their original works, as opposed to those who use companies like DistroKid or TuneCore, who likely won't have that same sort of deal in place, at least from day one.
Very interesting point.
It also speaks to how important it is to read the terms of service of the websites where content's being put up, right? Because if you put up something on Medium, does Medium then have the right to then license it without compensation to the writer, who actually owns the copyright to the word, right? And then they're licensing it to third parties for the purposes of training AI. I don't know Medium specific terms of service, but that's where it turns to. Like, so they, these social media aggregators can be putting in terms of service that says, by the way, if we license all the content that you, the different users of our platform, are putting up on our platform, we get to keep the money and we don't have to share it with you. And if you post there, well, that's what you're bound by, unfortunately. So
that's the issue right now between Universal Music Group and TikTok. Universal Music Group views TikTok as a traditional streaming service. TikTok views TikTok as a social media platform, and the rates for monetization are drastically different when comparing a traditional DSP to a social media platform. And so I doubt we're going to get the entire business on the same page anytime soon.
Right. I'm with you there. I agree.
Well, I would have to say one of the most controversial topics been copyright, and the other thing, I would say ethics and culture. I would direct this first to Brian, Zisook, and everybody else could jump in. I know you're extremely immersed in culture. You work directly with the artist community. In your opinion, Brian, what are some of the ethical considerations we should make, and how do we ensure the use of AI respects and represents diverse cultures?
Well, to tackle the first question, coming from the perspective of someone who runs a streaming service, I think one of the biggest issues that we've had to consider is the way that music that is entirely AI generated is being displayed on our service for users. In much the same way that AI created video and image content typically has some sort of watermark to indicate to the viewer or the audience that it is AI created. I think that there could be a future wherein if a product is delivered through a supply chain by a label or a distributor to a DSP or store, in much the same way the metadata includes an indication if that work is either explicit or clean, there should be an indication of whether or not it's being derived from machine learning or actually being voiced by the artist. I think why this matters is, especially when it comes to music, people like songs, but they connect with artists, and that connection is possible because humans naturally connect with humans. And so to not know whether or not what you're listening to is an actual human or a robot, sort of a big deal. And that's even if the vocals that the song was trained on were approved by the original rights holder. So I think that that's probably one of the biggest considerations, at least from the streaming service perspective. In terms of your second question, the digital age and the streaming age have already fundamentally changed the way artists are creating. Anyway, we've seen a dramatic decrease in the average length of song. Remember, on streaming services, in order to monetize a stream, you only need someone to listen for a minimum of 30 seconds. Whether they listen for 31 seconds or 2 minutes and 45 seconds, it's the same amount of money. And so artists are already considering the consumption behavior and habits of the streamer in creating works. And my fear is that a lot of this AI-driven creativity will just further feed into this cyclical loop where we're not really listening to anything different, and we're only creating and being served much of the same.
That is super
Yes, that's a
interesting.
fear. No, no, possibility.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry, the delay here is very difficult. Go ahead, please.
I was just going to quickly just on the ethical AI, or the ethical part of the question. You know, ethical AI is sort of a term. It's an important aspect maybe to mention. You know, ethical AI is supposedly the development and use of artificial intelligence that prioritizes fairness, transparency, accountability, and respect for human values. It's about trying to ensure that AI benefits society in a responsible way. It is an ongoing field of discussion and development. You know, there are ongoing guidelines and practices to try to ensure that AI is used responsibly. Not everybody it has embraced the ethical AI commitment, but that is a feature that is out there that I think is going to continue to advance as this whole topic advances.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, in the 1960s, the group the Archies was a made-up group that, you know, the artists behind it were not, you know, there was no names. You know, fast forward, like the Gorillas, you know, there's been moments in pop culture where there's been no name, no faced artist. I completely agree with you on the human connection. You know, like, people are not going to want to just connect to AI created properties, and that's what's going to take over, and nobody's going to listen to anything created by humans. And I don't buy that by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think that we're going to find over time that huge hits were created in large part by more AI, but cream rises to the top. So how often can that person keep creating as good as they created the first time? If they're great at it, they are going to stay. If they're not, well, they're not. If they can't move the levers over and over again, then they're not going to be in pop culture that long.
I think it's also just the broader fan engagement when we talk about human, right? Like I think it would be entirely possible for me to listen to something not really anything that the systems are producing today, but like cast out another year or two. I think it's totally possible I could listen to something generated by a machine and think it was catchy and like it. Like, I think that's possible. Just in the same way that I can be in a restaurant and hear a song I've never heard before. I have no idea. I also think, there's a lot of research. I think there's a study where they showed people the real Mona Lisa or an image of the real Mona Lisa. They showed a computer generated Mona Lisa, same thing, but told them that it was a computer generated Mona Lisa, and surprise, people rated lower the one that was generated by a computer. I think that's also generational, right? Like, I think that none of us grew up with the like computer generating Mona Lisa from when we were born. I'm sure my children would just be like, they're the same thing. But I do think that we like humans. We like the messiness of humans, right? Taylor Swift is not just a Taylor Swift song. It's the broader thing around Taylor Swift. And it's the conversation she has with her fans and the engagement she has with her fans and the recreation of that content by her fans and her response to that. Like, it's conversation in the broadest sense of the word. And I suppose you can try and automate some of that, right? We can go into some sort of like dystopic, it's all avatars and everything's being generated. And there have been, hints of that, of people trying to do that. But I think history and the history of art has also shown us that you have huge swings and reactions against those things too, right? Like, we wouldn't be in the mess of reality TV that we're in right now if what had come before it hadn't come, And so I'm pretty bullish on humans, at least as it relates to music. We might all
nothing else though.
Sorry.
Nothing else.
Yeah, I find this comment super interesting, Jessica, around people having this really strong bias for human-made material when they know.
No,
Maya, we're losing you.
Yes.
Oh, not coming in.
Yes. We didn't hear you.
Go off camera for a second. It's better.
Yeah, we can. Let someone else
Dr.
talk
Maya?
with him.
Yes, if you can go off camera and come back again, that'll be great. Yes. Yeah, we can see you now. Well,
Let's see now. Maybe now that you go off camera, maybe the audio will work better in the shot.
Okay, let's see. Is it coming better?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Okay, let's try. Yeah.
Can hear still in and out.
Yeah. All right. Let me know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Absolutely.
Is this working?
Yes.
Okay, let's try
yes,
again.
we can hear you.
Let me know if this cuts out. So I love Jessica's point about the judgment that people have for machine-created content, how it's people automatically devalue something because it's made with a machine. There were actually it's sort of a wide range of studies that were done on this topic, and it's very, very consistent to the point of complete devaluation of the same works. So you could take exactly the same work, tell people it's made by a human, and they like it a lot more than if it's made by a machine. And you see, I think people who use AI systems, especially collaborative AI systems, know that. And so as a result, people who create tools for people who want to. So when it comes to somebody creating an entire piece of music with an AI, that's one thing. But if you're using AI to help you, right now consumers realize that it's better to keep that private. It is better not to share the fact that that you use AI in the process, just because your audience is going to have a certain bias against it, even if the participation of the AI was relatively minor. And that's sort of a problem. That's a hindrance to transparency inherently. I wanted to make one more final brief comment around this idea of using AI leading to convergence of music. And I can totally see where that reasoning is coming from, because if it's trained on the same music and it wants to stay similar to that music, then of course we kind of result in convergence. I find that really fascinating, because the ethos of AI is actually to be able to explore the creative space of possibilities. It's sort of the opposite. It's all about being able to see more creative options than humans can see. But it's really interesting that given how humans have chosen to utilize technology in the past, we actually do stand a very real risk of more homogeneity. But it's really is a choice on how we choose to use this technology rather than what it's inherently is. And a lot of the limitations in AI really come from the way that kind of human greed and old ways of thinking kick in and connect with a new technology rather than what the technology inherently is.
Absolutely. I mean, good point that, AI really, especially when it comes to creativity, music, art, and mostly anything to do with creativity, I think it's better to be used, I would say, as a tool to help enhance and give a helping hand, because anything, to me, in my opinion, been in the record business for a long time, and I think, Brian and all of us could relate to this, that, music comes from a place of, how should I say, feelings, from happiness, from pain, from experience, from culture. Look at hip hop. Hip hop wouldn't be what it is because it came from somewhere that felt the culture, the pain, the happiness, the lifestyle, all of that. Country music, jazz, all of that. So with AI, yes, absolutely, it is a betrayal if you use it to create. I say, oh, I have AI, I'm going to create hip hop music, but AI doesn't have the feeling, doesn't have the experience, doesn't have the I'm talking about, Brian. You work with artists. You've been in the hip hop culture. You've been in other music, not just hip hop. There's country, there's jazz, there's all kind of music that comes from a basic experience, the culture, the feelings, as I mentioned.
Bob, no, specific to hip hop though.
Yeah.
I believe last year there was an entirely AI generated, not assisted, generated artist by the name of AI Mecca. And he actually got a recording contract, or they got, I don't know, a recording deal with Warner Records. And it came out within a few weeks of the announcement of the signing, the virtual signing, that the individuals behind this black artist were all white. And they played on every single cultural stereotype that has been long associated with practitioners within the hip hop space.
Yeah.
And this is an example of appropriation at the highest level. And then it wasn't until after there was a backlash on social media did the record label drop the virtual artist and try to sweep the entire thing under the rug. And there has not been another similar example since. But definitely something to keep in mind, and to go off of what Maya said, there's a fundamental difference between AI assisted and AI generated.
Correct. Yes. And that is very important. Very, very important to keep in mind and to take into account. Interesting topic. I think we can go on and on with it. Looking ahead, David Henkin, I know you have been listening and absorbing everything that our experts have to say. I'd like to hear from you on your opinion. How do we move forward in a positive way, ensuring that AI in music is used for good?
Yeah, I'm happy to share a thought, and certainly we'll hear from others. But
everybody else.
Yeah, I'd start maybe by saying that moving forward in a positive direction, ensuring that AI in music is used for good. I'd offer we need a multifaceted approach involving cooperation among industry stakeholders, policymakers, technologists, and even artists. Some key factors, many of which we've touched on here in some way. Transparency and accountability. Ensure algorithms are explainable and accountable, that tech firms, developers document their data sets used, the training methodologies employed, and any biases inherent in the models. Ethical guidelines and standards. We've seen some progress here. Guidelines ought to address things like copyright, attribution, diversity and fairness in recommendation systems, diverse representation. In AI research and development, and actively involving artists, musicians, and communities from underrepresented backgrounds in the development process. Education and awareness is critical for the general public and the music industry, helping them all to make informed decisions. Regulatory oversight. This is something I've written about, implementing regulatory frameworks that strike a balance between fostering innovation and protecting the rights and interests of musicians, creators, and consumers. Regulators ought to work closely with industry stakeholders to develop policies that promote ethical and responsible AI practices. Continuous monitoring and evaluation is critically important during these this early period of time, both to the horse and buggy, to the automobile example, and the photography example. And maybe as a last comment, kind of a community engagement, soliciting feedback and input on AI-driven initiatives. Create forums for dialogue and collaboration to foster trust and accountability within the industry. Hopefully by embracing, these kinds of attributes and working collaboratively, we have the opportunity to harness the tremendous potential of AI in music while safeguarding against some of the potential risks.
Interesting. The rest of the panelists, any take on this?
Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
Please, yes.
Sorry. Okay. I think I love this bit of comments. I think this was incredibly comprehensive. One thing that I'm finding from my vantage point is that as a founder in the space, is there's a lot of forces in the way that innovation comes to fruition that create a lot of uniformity and are really driven by greed, very, very significantly. And that's part of the reason why we see a lot of companies going after very similar goals, and sometimes in ways that don't support artists. Luckily, nobody here on this panel falls into that. And really what it takes on the ground is a certain commitment to making the impact that you want to see in the world, despite a lot of pressure to go after what appears to be the biggest financial opportunity, the largest possible market, which actually, interestingly, often end up resulting in complete failures when you try to boil the ocean. But we really, really need to support artists in the current ecosystem, where they're competing not only with each other, which is hard enough, but also with AI systems, and that's only going to grow. So I think we need committed entrepreneurs and people who in the ecosystem who are really committed to leveraging AI to help artists, not only prevent AI from hurting artists, where most effort goes, but build AI systems that genuinely, profoundly elevate human creativity. And that's going to help ensure that we're creating the kind of world that we all want to live in.
Absolutely.
Really great.
Any other points from any of the panelists?
The only thing I would add is, Maya mentioned how current artists are competing with AI. I always talk about how artists are competing for the free time of the consumer base, not just with one another. There are in excess of, on average, 100,000 new tracks uploaded to streaming services daily, right? So you have competition for all of the valuable real estate inside of a streaming service across, recommendation engines and editorial, and algorithmic spaces. But you're effectively competing with people who would otherwise be spending their time streaming video and reading news, going on social media, listening to audiobooks and podcasts, playing video games. And so for a lot of artists, they're already overwhelmed at all of the media that they're fighting for attention alongside. The prospect of now, hundreds of thousands of entirely computer generated works also existing or coexisting in this same space is quite overwhelming in what is an already extremely stressful position to be in as an aspiring creative.
Interesting. We have some audience questions for our experts. So we have a question from our audience to Maya Ackerman and Jessica Powell. What are your challenges faced in music mixing? And do you use any pre-trained models? If so, what are models you took inspiration from? This is for Dr. Maya and Jessica.
Jennifer, go ahead,
Whoever wants
please.
to go first, please.
Am I talking?
No.
Oh, okay. For music mixing, we don't do any mixing. What we do is we separate, but I can imagine the question was also just a general one of what we've used. All of our models are things that we've built in-house, so forth. Probably the same for Maya. So we don't rely on any open source or things like that for what we do. But yeah, depending on what the task is specifically you're looking at, I'm sure Maya and I have plenty of recommendations for like different open source models that we think are good. But yeah, we're on our side, we're not doing any mixing, we are separating.
Interesting.
Yeah, my answer is very
Dr.
similar.
Maya?
Yeah. I hope you can hear me. So it's my answer is very similar to Jessica's. Actually, we also don't focus on mixing. We have lyric generation. We have our own also homebrewed model. Actually, 6 different models for lyric generations that are powering Lyric Studio, and then multiple models to power Melody Studio for creating lead sheets. Mixing is actually, to the best of my knowledge, not a common use case of generative AI. I mean, mastering is something you can find on multiple platforms, including Lander. Yeah, I'm glad you bring it up. I mean, this is probably even if something exists, there's probably more opportunity for engaging AI meaningfully in that particular step of music creation.
Yeah, there's one thing, just to piggyback on what Maya was saying, and Maya's tech, by the way, is really great. It's the best lyric kind of generative tool that I've used, certainly. I think that, and so I'm gonna try and speak for Maya here too on this, because we've had a lot of conversations and because her video is glitching. But then Maya, if I get anything wrong that doesn't represent, feel free to just like make weird noises and we'll all realize they need to stop me. I think one thing that I think about a lot in relation to AI, broader than music, is just sort of like mediocrity and like a flood of just content coming at us. Again, not specific to music, though we can talk about it in terms of music. And I think there's this tension on the one hand between having this explosion of technology that does allow you to do so many cool things. And by the way, as someone was saying earlier, I think it was Maya, the thing that to someone like an amateur, the ability for them to be able to create and visualize just a video, for example, or an image, that's a small piece of this larger thing they're doing, but that's completely out of reach for them otherwise in terms of budget or skill, that can complement this other thing that they're doing, is so groundbreaking. For the person whose livelihood that is, it's a threat. Like all this stuff can coexist.
Mhm.
I think that one of the things, though, that does happen, and while you have this enormous opportunity, you also do have just this huge amount of content that is going to be across, streaming and UGC. And how do people break through? How do we as consumers even find what we're looking for? All of these are super legitimate questions that were already present, right? Before we talked about AI content generation, that was already the introduction of the streaming age itself. Or go back even further, the shift from like the news hour every night to 24-hour news. Like this is not like an overnight problem. Like with the past 30, 40 years, it's just increasing amounts of content. And I think that one of the things that on our side as a deep tech research company, that our, I guess, small contribution to attempt to kind of not be a part of that problem is to develop our own technology in-house that is the highest quality in this specific thing that we focus on, and that is very artist focused and is very practical and kind of professional use focused, with this idea of how do we help open up sound, in our case lyrics, and right, to other kinds of opportunities and make those things happen, rather than take the open source models and throw a pretty wrapper on top of it and just be one of many things that are out there that are contributing to that flood of content. Anyway, so I think that just going to your question about what we use, like that is why I think open source is incredible, and it's done so many great things for the industry and for science generally. But I think from our perspective, we really we focus on something very narrow so that we can do it as best as possible.
Great. Thank you.
And I'm saying we could switch out the end result. Their end result is audio, and our end result are the contracts to protect the creators. But exactly what you said of how you go about doing it and using your own algorithms and models, and the fact that it's about creating the best experience and the best output and giving access to people so that a broader group can have better access. It's the same attributes that we have, and speaks to David's, what's the highest level of ethics? It's like, can you create a product that's loved by millions and actually does it in a way that is not harming? And, obviously, as we talked about earlier about job disruption, but, maybe it's a dent down before it's an uprise after that. So.
Yeah. Our next question from a gentleman named James. For the group, concerns I hear from composers are around originality, both concerned about using the DNA from reverse engineered music, and also an intentional infringement. Okay.
The question is it an I didn't get the intentional part.
Yes, and also, well, because of using. Okay, let me repeat the question. That's fine. Concerns I hear from composers are around, originality. Both the concerns about using the DNA from reverse engineered music, which is, the training model, and also an intentional infringement. He said, you understand the question? Yeah.
Yeah, I think and I just saw the question. James, tell me if I'm wrong. I think there's actually two questions in here. One is actually saying you've got the mix of a track and people are extracting from that, and then they're doing something with that. And then a second one is potentially also tied to generative music. So let me start with generative, and then I'll come back to so on the generative music side, the question would be, which I think we might have touched on earlier, which is if you're training on tons of work out there, first of all, how do you guarantee there's obviously the compensation and is it ethical and that kind of thing that we already talked about. There's also the issue of what if you can reproduce the exact work that was in the training database, right? Like what if and that's a very, very small percentage of the output. And there's been a lot of studies on that around, but like that is a question that people have, right? What if you were essentially outputting what was also an input? And then you have how that intersects with questions around, is something that a generative system created, is it copyrightable? But the input was copyright, right? Like very complicated. No one, I think, on the call has the answer to that, but that is one question. On the deconstructing track, I think that's very much an issue. We don't have a stem splitter where you can just upload a Motown track and pull it apart. That is, we have an industry professional tool that's used by like labels and publishers and Dolby Atmos mixers and things like that, but we don't have something where you can just say purchase a James Brown bass line. But I believe we're the only stem separation company that has that restriction on it. So I think that that is a very legitimate question, because you can do fingerprinting and things like that, but once, as probably a lot of the people on this call know, once you're in a DAW, right, and you're layering different sounds and so forth, those watermarks, it's either going to break the audio or you will have already converted the format and you will have lost those things. And so it's very hard to track that stuff. Why, when we started, we actually had the content controls that we did, because we wanted to see kind of remixing and authorizations and so forth evolve a bit more before we opened up the technology further.
We have, I guess, if we have one, a room for one more question directed to the group, actually. From our listeners, what takeaways would you like audience members to leave this session with?
Be excited about what's coming. Don't fear it.
Good point.
Brian, I think you're on mute. Sorry.
Damn it, I hate when other people do that, and I just did it myself. My takeaway, because I like to spin everything positive for the
Yes.
artist community, is if you are a recording artist, embrace this. Embrace this as an opportunity to grow as a creative. Embrace this as an opportunity to learn about how all of these supplemental and ancillary components that exist in the same orbit as your music can help contribute to getting your career off the ground. Don't be afraid. It reminds me of when I was a kid. My parents got us the first desktop computer in the house, and I operated with the idea that like I couldn't break the computer and I would just try stuff. Of course, I absolutely broke that thing multiple times. We had to take it in and get it repaired. But the point being is that like you can't fear breaking something or doing something wrong if you don't at least try. You miss, as Michael Jordan would agree, you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. So try, just try it. Try everything it has to offer.
Yes, good point.
I would agree with that.
If I'm able to be heard here in this technology,
Yes.
I'd love to talk about. Yeah, I wanted to just kind of echo what you just said about trying things. Definitely, that should be the number one takeaway. Go out there, try the tools. You really like. People just end up equating ChatGPT with generative AI. Like you need to try the different systems out there. Try every musical generation system you can get your hands on. And I just have to quickly plug a response to the previous question. If built right, generative AI systems are less likely to plagiarize than human. Actually, we have a lot of systems built into our generative AI to make sure that it doesn't plagiarize. Humans unintentionally plagiarize each other all the time. So
Okay.
yeah, it's not, again, generative AI is not ChatGPT. There are systems that are built specifically for creators. So go out there, play with Audio Shake, play with Lyric Studio, play with Melody Studio, play with Brian's system, and everything you can try out there. And I think you're going to fall in love with it.
Anyone else?
Just building on all that, I think the future certainly can be very bright, but maybe to summarize some of that, get educated and get involved. Just know the difference between AI generated and AI assisted, for example, and get involved. I think, the more communities that are heard from, the more voices that are present in the dialogue will only help as we move forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I would have to say, I absolutely learned a lot from this summit. I myself and gained a lot of information, very useful. All right, this concludes today's summit. I would like to say a huge thanks to our panelists and audience. I learned a lot from it. I said it again, and I hope all you out there did the same. We will be sharing a deck with everything we discussed here today, as well as more information on our wonderful panelists and absolutely superstars. See you all in our next one. Thank you very much again, Brian, Dr. Maya, Jessica, David Henkins, and David Fritz. Really appreciate the time and the information that was shared with me and our audience. Great summit, and it's our first one, so if I was a little rusty, please excuse me, but I definitely enjoyed it.